To be culturally sensitive, we must gain awareness. Cultural sensitivity grows when we start to see the influences in our own culture and acknowledge that we have biases. This can be an eye-opening experience, and it may take courage and humility to walk this path. Cultural sensitivity is not about treating everyone the same. With cultural awareness and sensitivity comes a responsibility to act respectfully. Our intended target audience would be individuals that will be working with Aboriginal clientele, student nurses, established nurses, perhaps as part of an orientation task. We hope this presentation gives you insight to the problems that contribute to Aboriginal suicide in Canada. Please enjoy, and if you have any questions, we'll be glad to answer them at the end.
What is suicide? And is there a difference between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal suicide? How are they different? Are there different stats?
Aboriginal suicide follows a pattern, such as over 1/3 occurred between October and December, and on a Saturday or Sunday between 2400 hours and 6 in the morning. The weekend days may be in relation that Aboriginal suicide is more often done while intoxicated and as an impulsive act. Statistics show that Aboriginals have up to 5 times the average of suicide rates than non-Aboriginals. What causes Aboriginal suicide? McNeil, 2008, explains that there is a cultural disconnect as a result of colonial policies related to residential schools, reserved communities, loss of traditional lands, and erosion of language and cultural traditions have led to the loss of cohesion and identity within Aboriginal communities. The author believes they need empowerment within the context of own cultural because of relationships exist between the youth suicide rate and the degree of control that Aboriginals communities have over their own lives. The damage done to them has created a loss of confidence in Aboriginals as individuals and how they understand and live and how to make decisions. McNeil, 2008, finds that there is a relationship between self-identity and self-destructive behaviors among First Nations youth in Canada. McNeil claims that Aboriginal suicide reflects an overwhelming sense of shame and hopelessness within a fractured cultural, economic, and political environment. Racial stereotypes that portray the Aboriginal as inferior shape their consciousness and undermine their self-worth. McNeil believes that in a hunting culture that has been normalized by the use of firearms with a history of fighting with warfare, an adolescent develops using those parts of Aboriginal heritage and makes self-harm easier and translates into an increased suicide risk by up to 10 times the average of non-Aboriginal communities. The author says that among Aboriginal youth, the rate of suicide increases 4 to 10 times if there is a gun in the house. Aboriginal culture in Canada, as compared to non-Aboriginal culture in Canada, views guns as household requirements. Hunting is a necessity for some Aboriginal groups. It is an integral part of the culture and cultural continuity, according to McNeill. Young Aboriginals find themselves living in areas that are compromised in terms of their physical environment. An unhealthy external community environment coupled with inadequate substandard internal housing is responsible for many health problems related to air, water, asbestos, and lead contaminants. A statistical profile on the health of First Nations of Canada provides information on conditions such as sewage, poor and polluted water supply, inadequate dwellings, poverty level income, a low level of literacy, presence of drugs, alcohol, and firearms, and the inability of Aboriginal adolescents and their families to meet fundamental needs. All these conditions provide a harmful and unhealthy living environment that impacts First Nation adolescents by creating an environment where they cannot compete or survive with mainstream society. McNeill continues explaining that unhealthy environments in which Aboriginal youth find themselves may lead not only to severe physical, psychological, spiritual health problems, but can also rob them of life. Automobile and hunting accidents are common. According to McNeill, the consumption of alcohol is implicated in the development of severe and life-threatening health and social problems with Aboriginal males, who are 5 times more likely to die from alcohol-related conditions than non-Aboriginals. Native American deaths from car accidents are 4 to 5
According
times
to Baudouin
greater
et
than
al.,
the national
mental
average.
health services are not equipped to address issues of Inuit suicide and interventions such as suicide prevention. These programs are not effective because they are not congruent with indigenous culture and beliefs. On a social level, according to Baudouin, family difficulties such as infrequent or weak relationships between family members, the presence of physical or sexual abuse, the presence of substance abuse and mental health disorders in parents, and problems in romantic relationships all contribute to mental health issues and often suicide. Crowell of 2016 adds risk factors such as depression, substance use, parental substance abuse, a history of abuse, recent life events, and suicide or attempts among friends, as well as the negative effects of colonialism. McNeill finds that suicide for Aboriginal youth has unfortunately become a solution to cope with a variety of unbearable life stresses, hopelessness, and despair. Another major factor that leads to suicide among Aboriginals is having a close friend commit suicide or make an attempt to commit suicide. All of these factors are identified as risk factors for suicidal behaviors in Aboriginal populations. Colonialism, lasting impact. Colonialism of European settlers attempted to assimilate Aboriginal peoples into a Western way of life. It stripped them of traditional language, dress, values, rituals, and beliefs in an attempt to eliminate indigenous culture. The biggest undertakings by the governments to force assimilation on peoples included creation of reserves, residential schools, and forced adoptions, also known as the 60s Scoop. Residential schools were wrought with abuse, neglect, disease, and death. Children were forcibly removed from households, some never ever to return to their homes. The effect of residential schools and forced adoptions created a collective trauma shared by many Indigenous people. The eradication of culture and loss of language, erosion of traditional values, and the disintegration of traditional family structure are all long-term results of these policies. They have passed down through decades like colonial heirlooms. This effect is often referred to as intergenerational trauma, and it has left many communities' once proud cultural traditions buried deep and nearly smothered from years of shame and persecution. Aboriginal people can feel disconnected from their culture, traditions, and beliefs. Psychological effects of dislocation include despair, hopelessness, addiction, sexual and physical abuse, and ultimately suicide. Marginalized and oppressed people across the world share these same struggles. Strong cultural ties and social networks are protective factors for suicide. Reconnecting to indigenous culture can improve self-worth and identity. An increase in the destruction of indigenous culture and communities is correlated to higher suicide rates. In fact, before the 19th century, suicide was extremely rare in indigenous communities. It has only been since the arrival of European settlers and the ensuing assimilation that suicide among indigenous populations has steadily climbed since the 20th century.
Aboriginal ways of healing will probably include a spiritual journey. They believe very strongly in the family dynamic, and that when one is unwell, something on the aspect of life is off. So, in order to be fully healthy, the spiritual self, the physical self, all aspects of self must be healthy in order to keep everything balanced. They may also do healing together or use biomedicine. Gender roles also take a play in how they would treat or help the person, as it comes into play in health in general. And we have to keep in mind that Aboriginal people have different ways or beliefs of treatment depending on what area they are from or what group they associate with. Aboriginal ways of treatment are very holistic based, and we must incorporate them with Western medicine to be able to heal and help the whole person. According to Austin, 2019, Aboriginal people do not believe in strict diagnosis, like such as depression or suicidal ideation. They don't like labels, so they would rather work on the whole person, and they believe that someone is unhealthy when they're having such thoughts or ideations. So we have to be culturally competent as nurses and be aware of their belief system and be respectful of their ways of treatment, because it's very important in healing Indigenous communities or an Indigenous individual for them to have optimum health.
Smudging calls on the spirits of sacred plants to drive away negative energies and to restore balance. Sage is said to purify and drive out negative energy. Sweetgrass to attract positive energy, beauty and sweetness. Cedar to ward off sickness. Lavender to bring spiritual blessing. Many tribes consider tobacco to be the most sacred plant, chasing away bad or negative feelings and bringing on good and positive thoughts, and to connect people with the spiritual world. Native peoples use tobacco as medicine, smoked in the evenings and not as a daily occurrence.
Doctor in many places in this country. For Indigenous Canadians, it's even harder. So university medical schools across Canada are now working to get more doctors from Indigenous communities trained, hoping they'll give back to their own communities. Global Edmonton's Quinn Oler sat down with one of the students.
Second-year medical student Sean McKenzie is a proud member of the Mid-Isle Métis Nation.
So many people from my Mid-Isle Métis Nation actually reached out to me, and they were very open and said, I want to share my experience with the healthcare system so you can change it.
That opened his eyes to the struggles of his own community, not only in accessing care, but having someone who truly understands the culture.
So many of them don't even have basic access to a family physician, and of those who are getting treatment, Oftentimes it's subpar and inadequate treatment, and it's kind of provided by inconsiderate doctors who judge individuals based on their ancestry alone.
There are more than 90,000 physicians across Canada, and only 760 identify as Aboriginal. That's one doctor per 2,200 Indigenous Canadians.
I think the specific experience of colonization, the impacts of Indian residential schools, has left a legacy of mistrust and anxiety among Indigenous patients in particular.
Tabitha Kimball says getting more Aboriginal doctors into their communities is proving to be tough.
First Nation student coming from an on-reserve community, the greatest barriers is often related to the lack of intergenerational wealth transfer. The MD program and the dentistry program are quite costly programs, so even being able to consider being able to afford these programs is often a barrier.
As is the prospect of having to move hours away from their communities to train.
Kimball says the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation final report has already identified solutions, including asking government to do more to educate Aboriginal doctors and to keep them in their own communities.
I kind of want to fly in and fly out and do locum at various remote communities, and you know what, provide my time to populations or areas where there's a larger population of Indigenous people to get that positive health intervention, because right now they just don't have access to healthcare.
Even though he still has a few years to go.
Western ways of treatment may include psychotherapy, medications, strict diagnosis, and science-based treatments. So this includes medications, group therapy, counseling, and really looking at the science side of things. So in order to be effective with suicide prevention, we have to do trauma-informed care, recognize that intergenerational trauma that may be affecting the individual, and incorporating all aspects of health. So we have to be mindful of using Aboriginal ways of treatment along with the Western medications or treatment that they may have chosen, and being culturally competent as individual nurses to respect and incorporate those ways of being. We have to be mindful that some Aboriginal communities do not believe in mental health diagnosis. They believe someone is healthy or not healthy according to Austin et al. So we have to be careful in how we are wording things and how we come about helping them, as it may be disrespectful to them if we are very blunt and diagnosis based. The combination of both therapies is more effective as it recognizes the person holistically as an individual, but then if there is a neurotransmitter imbalance or something else going on, we can address both issues, providing optimum health.
Programs for Indigenous Suicide Prevention. National Aboriginal Youth Suicide Prevention Strategy, NAYSPS, is a suicide prevention strategy oriented towards Aboriginal youth with goals of educating Aboriginal youth on suicide prevention, strengthening key protective factors, strengthening collaborative links across government agencies and organizations, utilizing locally driven community plans for suicide prevention, improve crisis response in preventing suicide, and enhancing knowledge about what currently works in Aboriginal suicide prevention. Pros and cons. Pros: receives federal funding. NAYSPS is a fluid program and changes values depending on knowledge gained. It focuses towards community healing and wellness. Cons: oriented towards Aboriginal youth and not all age groups. NAYSPS is run by the Canadian government, which may hinder progress due to Aboriginal distrust in Western health programs. Anticipated outcomes of these programs: more Aboriginal families and communities taking part in projects, activities, and services that prevent suicide, more Aboriginal people taking part in delivering projects, activities, and services for preventing suicide, more awareness and practice of healthy behaviors among Aboriginal youth, more community ownership and capacity to identify and address youth suicide and other mental health issues, improved access to quality, well-coordinated programs and services for Aboriginal youth, family, and communities, less stigma associated with prevention and thoughts, ideations of suicide, and attitudinal changes around seeking mental health, counseling, and support. Hope for Wellness is a program open 24/7 that is oriented towards counseling or anonymously helping Indigenous individuals who are experiencing crisis. The pros of this program: available 24/7 for emergency intervention. Languages are available in English, French, Cree, Ojibwe, Inuktitut. Available to speak on the phone or online. Counselors can suggest local supports. The cons to this service is that services are not in person. Health Support Service offers mental health counseling, emotional support, and cultural supports to Indigenous people who have been affected by missing and murdered Indigenous women across Canada. Cultural support services can be offered locally, and health support services may be able to assist with transportation costs. The pros and cons to this program: the program is oriented towards focuses on those who are affected by missing and murdered Indigenous women and can therefore offer more specific help. Community elders and traditional healers are incorporated as cultural supports. The cons to this program: transportation assistance is not always possible. To search for the solution, you must first start with the truth. To address the issues of suicide within First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities, we must piece together some facts that are talked about, but not directly. There is a silence throughout the community about what is happening behind closed doors. Without its acknowledgement, root causes of childhood trauma will never be addressed. Though sexual abuse does not affect every Aboriginal person directly, it does indirectly. Sexual abuses and incest is on the rise. These discussions are not to bring shame, they are to bring healing. The issues of childhood sexual abuse within the Indigenous community is being brought forth in hopes to create change, hope, and prevent loss of life. I quote, "The survivors of the Indian residential school system have, in many cases, continued to have their lives shaped by the experiences in these schools. Persons who attended the schools continue to struggle with their identity years after being taught to hate themselves and their culture. The residential school led to disruption in the transference of parenting skills from one generation to the next. Without these skills, many survivors have had difficulty in raising their own children. In residential schools, they learn that the adult often exert power and control through abuse. The lessons learned in childhood are often repeated in adulthood, and with the result that many survivors of the residential school system often continue to inflict abuse on their own children. These children, in turn, use the same tools on their children. There are many factors that contribute to the suicide rates of the Aboriginal people, and for each community, those factors are different. In some communities, the suicide rate is very low. In other, smaller, more rural communities, like Nunavut, the suicide rate among children and youth was 33% higher than the rest of Canada between 2004 and 2008. Suicide rates were highest among youth aged 15 to 24, and the suicide rate was nearly twice as high among First Nations people living on reserves and those living off reserve. An area of great concern is the high rate of suicide among Indigenous children under 15. The suicide rate among First Nation boys nationally was 4 times higher than that among non-Indigenous boys. It was 10 times higher among First Nation boys living on the reserve. The Aboriginal People Survey, conducted by Statistics Canada in 1991, asked both on and off-reserve Aboriginal respondents about a number of social problems in their communities. Unemployment, alcohol and drug abuse were most of the frequently reported problems. However, family violence, sexual abuse, and rape were also frequently identified as concerns. The results indicate high rates among all Aboriginal identity populations, but especially among Inuit and on-reserve Indians. In a study conducted by the Alliance of 5 Research Centers on Violence in 1999,
It was reported that 54% of Aboriginal girls under the age of 16 have experienced some form of unwanted sexual attention. 24% experienced rape or coercive sex, and 17% experienced incest. 75% of these victims were under the age of 18. 50% were under the age of 14, and 25% were younger than 7. In another study by the Northwest Territories, the Royal Commission of Aboriginal People found that 8 out of 10 girls under the age of 8 had been victims of sexual abuse. In addition, 50% of boys the same age had also been sexually molested. It was found that the majority of victims were abused by someone in their family, extended family, elders, and medicine men. It was also found that the incest tended to be multi-generational. Among these reports, it is also noted that many instances of abuse go unreported, and these figures are actually higher. Because childhood sexual abuse victims are 3 times more likely to commit suicide, I would recommend a program that helps the Aboriginal community break the silence within the community regarding sexual abuse. Many survivors are scared to speak out because of the family connection as well as the status of some of the abusers, for example, elders, chiefs, or medicine men. The feelings of shame, guilt, and despair are at times overwhelming for both the victim and the abusers, which can lead to continuation of mental health issues and suicide.
Hello, welcome back to our online post show. We were discussing what's being done to combat the staggering rates of attempted suicide taking place in some Indigenous communities across Canada. Let's get back to that conversation. Now, if I remember rightly, Jocelyn, you were just about to say something, but we were right at the end of the show. So pick up, go ahead. What were you going to add to our conversation?
Yes, I just wanted to add to the comment that there's a lot of services. Actually, my experience is the opposite of that. I had to go outside of Canada to get the services that I needed. As I stated, as a surviving suicide and surviving incest and sexual abuse and the political violence that comes out of that from my own Indigenous community, I had to leave the community. I had to flee from the lateral violence. And that suicide attempt at 15 catapulted me to get counseling. I went on to Minneapolis, Minnesota into a 28-day program for women who've been sexually abused as children. From there, I was able to access the Center for Treatment of Childhood Sexual Abuse and Childhood Trauma, specifically dealing with incest and sexual abuse issues. And so while we have alcohol and drug treatment facilities, we don't have enough programs directly dealing with incest and sexual abuse. It's a taboo subject. Nobody wants to touch it. And this is why I'm saying Attawapiskat is our alkali lake. We need to have those professional people that are in the front lines, the social workers, the counselors, the Crown prosecutor that has stated that she has never met someone from the communities who hasn't been sexually abused. Those are profound statements. I've had police officers tell me exactly, validating and confirming what I've been saying for decades. And so we need to bring that to the forefront. You can develop all kinds of programs, but if you're not dealing with the perpetrators and you're allowing them to continue to get away with it, and not only get away with them, but we have perpetrators that are disguised as helpers and leaders. And it's not helping our people when we're pretending that's not happening. And so children out there, they need somebody who they could say, you know what, I'm an incest survivor. I've been waiting for my justice for over 20 years.
Sexual abuse within within the communities are just beginning to take place. The main obstacle towards healing is denying its existence. The problems associated with sexual abuse are complex and intergenerational, but they are here and they need to be acknowledged. The consequences are devastating and they end up continuing the cycles of abuse. To move towards healing and to achieve the vision for the future, these issues need to be addressed. Let us do this for the youth, the elders, and everyone we have lost. Let us break the silence and paddle together towards a true healing future.